The government says it has been in contact with the IRA for years. Amid calls for his resignation, the Northern Ireland Secretary insists he has deceived no one. There have been no talks, no negotiations. But Sinn Féin's president dismisses the government's version of events as a lie. Good evening. The Northern Ireland Secretary has been defending the government's contacts with the IRA. Sir Patrick Mayhew said a channel of communication had existed between the government and the IRA for a number of years, but had been broken off earlier this month. The Sinn Féin president, Gerry Adams, tonight accused Sir Patrick of lying about the nature and detail of the contacts. The most recent series of contacts between the government and the IRA started sometime in February of this year. The IRA passed a message to the government seeking advice on how to end the conflict in Northern Ireland. On March the 22nd, 2 days after the Warrington bombing, a meeting took place between Sinn Féin and a person acting for the government, in which a document written by the Northern Ireland Secretary was handed over. On November the 5th, the government made its most recent communication with the IRA 2 weeks after they killed 10 people in the Shankill Road bombing. 10 days later, the leader of Sinn Féin, Gerry Adams, claimed the government had been involved in dialogue with his organisation and said he had documentary evidence to prove it. Last night, the government admitted for the first time that there had been contacts with the IRA, but that no negotiations had taken place.
Whether the Northern Ireland Secretary has a future as a minister depends entirely on his credibility, not just in his party, but on the streets of Northern Ireland. At his news conference, he maintained that he acted properly and within policy in response to an IRA message that the conflict was over and they wanted advice on how to end it.
You have two choices. One is to say they can't mean it, in which event you have to answer to people when there is a subsequent outrage, no less inexcusable than all the rest. You have to answer to people as to why you brushed aside and took no action upon a message of that kind. That's what you have to do. And the other choice is to say, well, very well, actions will count louder than words, but you say you're asking for advice. Here it is. I chose the latter.
He said his impression was that the original message from the IRA was an unconditional offer to end violence. He said he was responsible for all the communications with the Republicans and that he hadn't deceived anyone. His repeated denials were simply to protect the channel of communication.
I was not going to disclose by volunteering that there was an exchange of messages down the chain of communication by a process that I am not going to describe for the reasons that I have given, because to do so can endanger life. I was not going to volunteer and break that confidentiality.
All the documents, his and the IRA's, will be placed in the House of Commons library for public scrutiny tomorrow. One of the government's papers accepted that there could be dialogue even if an end to violence was not publicly announced.
I shall be entirely content to have the matter judged, both by Parliament and by the people of Northern Ireland, as to whether there has or has not been a worthy response to a statement received in February from the leadership of the IRA claiming the conflict is over. And I am entirely content to stand by that.
Leading Republican Martin McGuinness, according to Sir Patrick, sent the original message, which in the government's own words had come from the leadership of the IRA. Unionists are furious that Mr McGuinness is allowed to walk free given that, but he's always denied IRA membership and never been convicted for terrorist-type offences in Northern Ireland. And a short time ago, the Sinn Féin president, Gerry Adams, accused the government of lying. Under the government's restrictions, his words are spoken by an actor.
The process of dialogue and contact between the British government and Sinn Féin was more than a mere conduit. I also want to point out that it was also authorised by John Major with the knowledge of other cabinet ministers and involved a number of senior civil servants. At no point was there ever any communication from the IRA that, to quote Mr Mayhew, the conflict is over.
Some unionists will never trust Sir Patrick Mayhew again.
If anybody really believes that the people of Northern Ireland are going to swallow a statement such as the Northern Ireland office have put out, that the most sophisticated terrorist organisation the world has ever known had to send a message to the Northern Ireland office to say, look, we want to stop our violence. Can you tell us how we do it? Now, really, how incredible is that kind of statement? I don't believe it.
The government itself doesn't know what the consequences of these revelations will be. It all hangs on whether the official line is accepted, or the feeling is that there was at best economy with the truth and the betrayal of a key principle: don't talk to the men of violence. Dennis Murray, BBC News, Belfast.
Sir Patrick Mayhew is to make a full parliamentary statement about the contacts between the government and the IRA tomorrow. At the same time, he'll release the text of the messages passed to and from the terrorists.
It was shortly after the Warrington bombing, which killed 2 young boys in March, that ministers gave their key response to the IRA's secret message. The document handed over then admitted this process is fraught with difficulties for the British government. So why such a risk? The man who was then the Northern Ireland Security Minister was in no doubt today.
It came out of the blue from the IRA, and when a message arrives saying the conflict is over and asking advice for how you solve it, it would have been criminally foolish not to respond, because the one thing everybody's been trying to work for is an end to the violence.
It isn't the first time a British government has had contacts with the IRA. Despite the anger of unionists and the fears of Tory MPs, Lord Whitelaw had talks with them in 1972. Tories have tacitly accepted that contacts at some stage were inevitable if peace was ever to be achieved. But like the Ulster unionists who met Mr Major this week, they'd assumed from the vehemence with which talks or negotiations were denied that the government was denying even contacts. One party leader insists Mr Major can only restore his credibility as a negotiator now by putting his own new proposals on the table.
I believe the way the government has handled this, or should I say mishandled it, has now enabled people to put a question mark against the trustworthiness and credibility of Mr Major in these negotiations. You cannot build peace in Northern Ireland unless there is trust, and that trust now has been severely damaged.
Premature disclosure was always the risk. But despite this weekend's revelations, the chief opposition party will leave harrying the Prime Minister to another day.
The Labour Party isn't concerned with his integrity because we have our own opinions about that. What we're concerned about is making sure that the peace process gets along. So we're not looking for scalps on our belts or immediate resignations. That's for them to decide. What we want is to ensure that the peace process goes on, because the lives of people are at stake in this matter, and that's more important than the fate of particular Prime Ministers or Secretaries of State.
The focus shifts now to getting the peace initiative back on the rails at the Dublin summit. Labour, anxious not to prejudice the peace process, is pulling its punches for now. Closet Tory critics are waiting for someone else to strike the first blow. Though Sir Patrick Mayhew will have a tough time in the Commons tomorrow, ministers believe that if Mr Major puts his head down and rides through the storm, there is still the hope of a peace deal. If eventually he gets it, the current furore will be forgotten. If he doesn't, it will come back to haunt him.
Our Ireland correspondent Dennis Murray is in our Belfast studio. Dennis, how much damage do you think this could do to the peace process?
Well, I don't think it's done much with the Irish government, who would probably agree with Kevin McNamara and John Hume that the prize of peace that is there to be won is too big to be worth risking for things like this. But I think there is huge embarrassment to the British government. They would infinitely prefer this had not leaked out. I agree with Robin entirely that Sir Patrick will have a very rough time indeed tomorrow.
So there is a real sense of embarrassment, you think, within government ranks?
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, everyone who was at Sir Patrick's news conference today said he looked uncomfortable. Journalists were accusing him of stumbling over his syntax. I think there's absolutely no question that the government, as I said, infinitely would prefer that this had not leaked out. And I think they are hoping that the gloss they have put on it will carry them through the storm.
Dennis, thank you very much.
Good evening. This is the news from ITN. Tonight's headlines. The Northern Ireland Secretary admits contacts with the IRA go back years, not months. Sinn Féin says government contacts were authorised by Prime Minister with the knowledge of Cabinet colleagues. The government has been in secret contact with the IRA for years and not just months, according to the Northern Ireland Secretary Sir Patrick Mayhew. Downing Street has strongly defended these contacts. A spokesman said it would have been irresponsible to ignore the IRA's overtures about how to end the violence in Northern Ireland. Sinn Féin, the political wing of the IRA, says the Prime Minister personally authorised the contacts and several cabinet ministers knew about them.
In the end, the government has had to drop all the careful words and phrases and admit that there's been contact, as with last February's IRA message, through a secret channel of communication with them.
That came by a channel or chain of communication that has been in place for some years. And that channel of communication has been the means of communicating in each direction messages, the value of the chain being that it is confidential.
Sir Patrick's problem, though, and the government's, is that in the public's eyes, today's admission hardly seems to square with what he's said in the past.
Nobody has been authorized to talk or to negotiate on behalf of the government with Sinn Féin or with any other terrorist organization.
This, we now know, is how things have gone. In 1990, contacts, Sinn Féin say a face-to-face meeting, began and continued into 1992. In February this year, an IRA message told the government the conflict is over and asked what to do next. On March the 22nd, 2 days after the Warrington bombs, Sir Patrick Mayhew sent back a verbal and written message telling the IRA to end the violence. In July, according to Sinn Féin, face-to-face contact ended, but messages still went back and forth. Indeed, as late as the first week of this month, Sir Patrick has confirmed messages were still being exchanged. But he still angrily insisted today that all of that did not mean anyone had been authorized to talk to the IRA.
And let it be known what the context of all this is, for goodness sake. Is there a price being offered to the IRA by the British government? That is the context, and nothing of that kind has taken place at all.
But for the opposition, that's not a good enough explanation of what the government's been about.
They, by their stupidity of seeking to hide something which any normal government would do, i.e. try and keep contacts open by intermediaries or whatever, but by denying that, have in fact placed the whole of the peace process in jeopardy. And that is a criminal, in fact, one might almost say a sinful thing to have done.
In the Commons tomorrow, when Sir Patrick Mayhew makes his statement, the government is likely to come under opposition attack, not just for being economical with the truth, but for playing a difficult hand badly, and of being too fearful of the unionist backlash to admit what was really going on before now. Michael Brunson, ITN, Westminster.
In Northern Ireland, the Unionists have demanded the resignation of the Prime Minister and the Northern Ireland Secretary. Ian Paisley accused them of deliberate, barefaced lying. Our chief political correspondent, Glyn Mathias, is in Belfast and has been assessing the reaction from both sides of the sectarian divide.
The revelations of contacts between the IRA and the government have thrown the peace process into disarray. The Northern Ireland Secretary repeatedly insisted the contacts did not amount to negotiations, but he could not have ignored the message from the IRA.
I do not believe, had I made no response, I do not believe, and the government had made no response, I do not believe that if subsequent bombs were exploded and lives were taken and people were injured, as indeed was the case, I would have been readily forgiven by the people of Northern Ireland.
But Sinn Féin's Gerry Adams this afternoon claimed the contacts were more than just a channel of communication. Under the government ban, we can't broadcast his voice.
It was authorised by John Major with the knowledge of other cabinet ministers and involved a number of senior civil servants.
The Democratic Unionists called for Sir Patrick and John Major to resign. One of their MPs had the leaked document already in his pocket when they met the Prime Minister last week.
I was wanting him to say something, and I was seeking and endeavouring to say something that would prove that he was going to tell us exactly what was happening, so it could allay some of the fears that certainly were in my own heart. Unfortunately, that was not so.
The response from the larger of the unionist parties has been more measured. Unless there are further revelations, it seems unlikely that the Ulster Unionists will break off their support for the government in the Commons, upon which the Prime Minister has come to rely. Glyn Mathias, ITN, Belfast.
It's 9 o'clock. The Northern Ireland Secretary Sir Patrick Mayhew will make a statement to the House of Commons this afternoon about the government's admission that it has been involved in secret contact with the IRA. He'll publish the text of some of the messages which passed through intermediaries between the government and leading Republicans. Ian Paisley's Democratic Unionists have demanded that both Sir Patrick and the Prime Minister resign.
The Northern Ireland Secretary was given a hard time at his news conference in Belfast yesterday and can expect an equally rough ride in the Commons today over allegations that MPs have been misled. Sir Patrick maintains the government was simply responding to peace overtures from the IRA and insists there were no negotiations with terrorists. But Unionist MPs are far from happy with this explanation.
Today, the integrity of the Prime Minister and the integrity of the Secretary of State is on the line. They have been guilty of lying and deception.
A minister should not willingly mislead the House. And recently we had a junior minister, parliamentary private secretary, have lost his position because he actually spoke out against increased salaries for MPs. That doesn't seem to me to be as dangerous as misleading the House willfully.
But the SDLP leader, John Hume, who has also faced unionist criticism over his contacts with Sinn Féin, hopes this new row will not undermine the peace process.
I have never in the last 20 years seen the hope for a total cessation of violence that I see at the moment. And I'm saying to Mr. Major, the key is in your hand to turn that door, to open the door to that future of peace and stability.
The Northern Ireland Secretary has said that all messages to and from the IRA will be made public at Westminster today. They'll be closely scrutinised by MPs on both sides of the House, with the government hoping that the wording will go some way to defusing the row. Peter Gould, BBC News.
The Sinn Féin President Gerry Adams has told the BBC that recent contact was initiated by the government, not the IRA, and he claimed considerable progress had been made. Government restrictions mean we can't broadcast Mr. Adams' voice.
Certainly we hadn't reached the point where we could be moved towards, all of us, the British and the rest of the Irish people, towards a peace process. But we had made some considerable progress in exchanging documents, in giving elaborations, in giving clarifications from both sides.
Commons surrounded and supported the Secretary of State after he explained in detail for 15 minutes how and why contact had been made with Sinn Féin and the IRA and the reasons why he had not been able publicly to admit that it was going on. Sir Patrick's outline included one line which must have alarmed Unionist MPs, that on November the 5th this year, Sinn Féin was offered a place in talks with the British government by January next year if it renounced violence immediately. Summing up his position, Sir Patrick had this to say.
That our main objective has been to reinforce and spell out in private our publicly stated positions. It is for the IRA and their supporters to explain why they have failed to deliver the promised ending of violence. They should do so at once.
Having listened to what Sir Patrick had to say, the Reverend Ian Paisley claimed contacts weren't the issue.
The people of Northern Ireland today demand that the Secretary of State explains why he issued falsehoods himself, got officials to issue falsehoods, and Downing Street backing up those falsehoods.
When the Speaker asked Dr. Paisley to apologise for the use of the word falsehood, he refused and after a vote was expelled from the House for the day. But Labour left-winger Dennis Skinner raised the same point, but in a parliamentary way.
The issue is that everybody's been taught to believe that in this democracy, when ministers say at the dispatch box and on Parliament and government's behalf outside, that they're doing one thing, and yet behind the people's back they're doing another, then there is a question of honour and resignation. And yet I didn't hear the Secretary of State ever mention the word apology for this mess. There was no reference at all to anybody's stomach turning over. And the question he's got to answer, and it'll hang round his head for a long time, is whether anybody can trust him again in the future, together with the Prime Minister. That's the problem that they have to face, not the question of the peace initiative, whether they're going to believe ever again. And he ought to do the honourable thing and resign.
When the DUP MP Peter Robinson followed up on the same lines, the Secretary of State was particularly scathing in his reply.
And would the Secretary of State recognise that he needs more than the confidence of his colleagues in this House to do his job and to do it well? He needs the confidence of the people of Northern Ireland, and he hasn't got that anymore.
Of course I was not going to volunteer that there was a means, a channel of communication, which was one whose value has been maintained over, as has been clear, very many years, 20 years. Supposing the time were to come when the IRA were to say, however belatedly, that the conflict is over, that they need advice only as to how it is to be tied up. Am I to suppose that we should have been better served, that the public would have been better served if there had been no such channel, if there had been no means by which they could send a message? If that's what he's saying, then I don't think the House is with him.
Seamus Mallon of the SDLP spoke for Labour as well when he supported the contacts the government had had, but he urged that the matter shouldn't be a distraction to the main action.
That he was right to enter into the deliberations which he entered into, and indeed I would have thought, had he not done so, it would have been a dereliction of duty on his part. Could I also say that at this very important and sensitive time, that the controversy surrounding these deliberations should not be allowed to hide the real challenge that faces us all, and that is the challenge of creating peace within the island of Ireland, a peace which will affect all sections of the community and which will last.
Unionist Ken McGuinness, while critical of the folly of contact with the IRA and Sinn Féin, asked for an undertaking for the future.
Taking account of the folly of anyone in believing that the word of the Provisional IRA can ever be taken at face value, and that any evasion and equivocation by the government front bench only presents Republican terrorists with a propaganda victory, can this House take some comfort from the fact that members would not have had any official confirmation of the rumours which have been circulating since May or June if the IRA had not had their political demands rejected by the government? Can we continue to rely, therefore, on assurances by the Secretary of State and his right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, that the democratic process will never be subverted in favour of terrorist demands?
The Secretary of State gave the undertaking he required, leaving critics feeling very much in the minority.
A delegation from the town of Warrington is in Belfast to establish closer links in the aftermath of the IRA bombing there, in which 2 children died. Commenting on the government's contacts with the IRA, the Mayor of Warrington said peace had to be the overriding objective. Belfast Lord Mayor said the government had been left with egg on its face.
There's now a bond between Belfast and Warrington. Both places have suffered at the hands of the IRA, so not surprisingly this morning, civic leaders from there and from here were willing to comment on the government's contacts with the Provisionals.
I am not a great believer in letting terrorists see that they have won. But at the end of the day, the overriding thing has got to be peace.
The provosts are now driving the whole operation. They're dictating the terms. They're at the centre stage, and the government has been left with egg on its face, to say the least of it.
The Warrington delegation is in Belfast so that closer links can be developed. The Warrington Project was established after the March bombing, in which 2 children were killed. Project coordinator John Donlan lost his nephew. He hopes the scheme will promote good from the evil of the atrocity.
We hope to raise the level of awareness of Ireland in England and England in Ireland, and we are starting at the grassroots level in schools and working in conjunction with the University of Liverpool. We're hoping to develop a 4-year programme which will enable exchanges to take place and a range of teaching material to be developed.
This is an unusual peace process in that it's municipal council to council. Now, in the past, it's been individuals and so on, but you're now talking about local authorities, which are obviously permanent institutions, and I think that differentiates this project from previous ones.
The Warrington delegation will meet other community leaders here. All concerned hope that the exchange of gifts and good wishes marks a bit of history in the making.
An army bomb disposal team has carried out 5 controlled explosions on a car in Cookstown. It's believed to contain a mortar and was abandoned behind the chapel only yards from the local primary school. The RUC say the white Ford Escort was taken by a group of armed men from a family they held captive on Saturday night in Pomeroy. Security forces came under attack in West Belfast earlier today. Shots were fired at a joint police and army patrol near New Barnsley police station this afternoon. Fire was not returned and no one was injured. 2 would-be bombers caught red-handed with a Semtex bomb have each been jailed for 20 years by the Crown Court. 46-year-old Stephen McGee of Whitecliffe Parade and 36-year-old James McGivern of Ballymurphy Crescent denied possessing the 3 to 4 pound bomb and conspiring to cause an explosion. They were arrested in October 1991, leaving a Ballymurphy Road bomb factory. A firebomb has been discovered at a restaurant in Belfast's Kennedy Way. The incendiary had partially ignited under a seat at TJ Stakers, causing slight damage. It was discovered at lunchtime. 3 men arrested in a stolen car with loaded handguns have been jailed for a total of 36 years. 33-year-old Marshall Walker of Ballybean Square, Simon Corrie, aged 21, of Greymount Crescent, and Thomas Finlay of Cuba Walk were each jailed for between 14 and 10 years. Judge Peter Gibson said one could only speculate as to what the trio were intending to do.